I stepped out into the hallway, listening intently. Total silence. I snuck my way down the hall and to the stairs. I was moving slowly and cautiously, even though I knew I was alone. For all I knew, Eddie had booby-trapped the house in case I tried to escape while he was gone. I had to be careful. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking around the living room. The lights were off downstairs and it was gloomy because all the windows were boarded over. There was just barely enough light coming in through the tiny window on top of the front door. The only one not covered, to allow me to see. It was eerie seeing the deserted, shadowy living room that resembled the set from Till Death Do Us Part. For some unexplainable reason, it reminded me of a long-abandoned but perfectly preserved home in a post-apocalyptic movie. I spotted a lamp on the end table. I quickly turned it on. The first thing I did was look around for a phone. I didn't see one, and then I went to the front door and tried opening it. As I had expected, it was locked. I glanced at the plywood-sealed windows on either side of it. I began to look around for something I could use to try prying them open, or even better, a spare key to the front door. I opened the drawers of a bureau to find them empty. Totally empty. I spied a small desk in the corner of the living room and checked its drawers. Also completely empty. It didn't make sense. There were no personal items of any kind, no junk mail or bills or correspondence or any of the odd and ends you'd expect to find in a typical living room drawer. It was as if everything was just a hollow prop that existed solely to fulfill Eddie's delusion of being part of the Till Death Do Us Part universe. The kitchen. Maybe there was something in there I could use. I went in. The 4 department store mannequins, I wondered if he'd brought them from home from the mall he worked at, that had been made to look like the Glovers were still seated at the table. They seemed to be staring in my direction, and gave me the creeps. I spotted another door I hadn't noticed the first time I'd been in the kitchen. Like the 2 doors upstairs, it was securely locked with a padlock. I assumed it went down to the basement. I looked through the kitchen cabinets and drawers. Basic cookware and dishes and utensils. I noticed there were no knives or other sharp objects. He must have stashed them somewhere else. I looked in the fridge. I gagged. All the food in it was moldy and stank. The expiration date on the bottle of curdled milk was last December. I quickly shut the fridge, then looked in the freezer. All it contained were frozen dinners. I glanced down at the hall that led to the garage, and I entered it. I tried the door to the garage. Unsurprisingly, it was locked. I saw another door and opened it. It was a combination laundry room pantry, washer and dryer, shelves stocked with canned food, nothing else. This room didn't have a window. Where did this guy keep his tools? Maybe there was a shed outside. Or maybe they were down in the basement. In which case, I was screwed. Dejected, my mission a failure, I turned and went back into the kitchen, intending to return to my room and wait for Eddie to come home and take me to the prom. Halfway across the floor, I froze. I'd heard something. I listened. Nothing. I must have imagined it. But then I heard it again. A barely audible sound I couldn't identify. I looked around the kitchen, and the sound came again. I looked at the padlocked door I'd assumed led to the basement. The sound seemed to be coming from that direction. I pressed my ear against the door and listened. A moment of silence. And then I heard it. More clearly now. I felt my blood curdle in my veins. It was a groan. A low, muffled groan made by what was unmistakably a human voice. It was coming from down below. I wasn't alone in the house. Someone else was being kept prisoner here. My mind was racing. Who else could that lunatic be keeping here besides me? And why? At least I understood, well, sort of, Eddie's motive for wanting me. The moan came again. It sounded pained. I couldn't tell if it was coming from a man or a woman. Hello? I called out. Is someone down there? A moment passed in silence. Then the moaner began grunting rapidly in excitement as if responding to my voice. I realized they were trying to say something, but it was completely unintelligible and muffled. Maybe Eddie had put a gag in their mouth. Hold on! I said. I'm gonna try to get you out. I looked around for something I could use to remove the heavy padlock. I gave up pretty quickly. It was hopeless. I had already searched the downstairs pretty thoroughly and hadn't found any keys. Eddie must have taken them with him. I considered trying to use something as a tool to pry the lock off the basement door, but if I failed, Eddie would see the marks. And even if I did succeed in freeing Eddie's other mystery captive, we would still be trapped inside this house. Listen to me, I said loudly. I can't get you out of here, but I'm going to try and get out of here and get help for you. Just hold on. The groan came again, a sound of utter despair. I felt guilty leaving the kitchen, like I was abandoning them down there. But what else could I do? I couldn't even get myself out of this nightmare. I went back upstairs, pausing only long enough in the living room to shut off the lamp, leaving everything exactly as I had found it. Back in the upstairs hallway, as I was heading back to my room, I happened to glance at those two padlocked doors. I stopped. The padlock on the door adjacent to mine, which I assumed led to Eddie's room, where I'd heard him arguing with his violent alternate personality, Ted, last night, was hanging from its hasp. But it hadn't been fastened. Eddie must have forgotten to lock it after he got ready for work this morning. I stood there, briefly debating the pros and cons of opening that door. Eddie could come back anytime unexpectedly, and if he caught me out of my room, intruding upon his personal domain, well, that would probably be the end of me. But maybe that's where he kept his spare keys, or a tool I could use to break out of the house. Maybe that was where he kept his kitchen knives. If he had and I found it, he was going to get a big surprise when he got home. I removed the padlock, hesitated for only a moment, and then swung open his door. I turned on the light and looked into his room. I stood there for some time before I entered, just staring. Oh my God. It was the bedroom of a 10-year-old boy. The bed was shaped like a race cart. It looked way too small for Eddie to still be using as an adult. He must sleep on it with his feet hanging over the bottom. The wallpaper had a pattern of rocket ships and stars and planets, and there was a bookcase with its shelves lined with stuffed animals and toys. I forced myself to enter and began looking around. I was extremely careful to place everything back exactly as I found it, if Eddie noticed his stuff had been moved around. I couldn't find my gun. He must have taken it to work with him, nor could I find any tools or weapons. I opened his wardrobe. His clothes were hanging neatly from the rod next to the spare security uniform. At the bottom of the wardrobe was an old scrapbook. I picked it up and flipped it open. The first few pages contained old pictures of Eddie. For the sake of simplicity, I'm still referring to him as Eddie, even though I know his real name was Francis. As a child, I recognized his curly brown hair and blue eyes, with what I assumed were his parents, and a teenage boy with dark hair and a hard, penetrating stare. They looked like a perfectly normal family. But there was something unnerving about that older boy's hard, piercing eyes, and the humorless expression on his face. I turned the page and came upon a picture of Eddie, smiling for the camera with heartbreaking innocence, standing next to the older boy in front of a Christmas tree, its base laden with wrapped presents. Beneath it was a handwritten caption: Christmas 91, Francis, age 5, Ted, age 16. I was startled. Eddie really did have an older brother named Ted. What had happened to him? Where was he? Was he possibly the one Eddie was keeping locked in the basement? I turned the page. An article from a newspaper, the Louisville Courier-Journal, dated April 11th, 1993. Local couple dies in auto wreck. The photos that accompanied the article were of the older couple I recognized from the family pictures. Eddie and Ted's parents. I felt a pang of sympathy for Eddie. He would have been only 7 when he'd lost them. Could that have been the cause of his mental instability later in life? I turned the page and gasped. It wasn't a news article or a headline. The face of a pretty 19-year-old girl with curly, fire-red hair was smiling at me. My own younger face. It was a picture in an interview that I had given to TV Guide in 1994. one I had completely forgotten ever doing, and the only time anyone had ever been interested enough to ask me for an interview. Not long after Till Death Do Us Part had premiered. Feeling numb, I glanced at the experts from the interview. I'm hoping the show will open the door to bigger roles for me. I guess you could say I'm pretty ambitious. I would love to work with Johnny Depp. At the bottom, someone had childishly drawn a heart with an arrow through it. In the arrow were the initials F, V, and EG. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned the page and frowned, confused. I turned another page. The next few pages all contained news articles covering a series of murders being committed throughout the area. Young women, most of whom had been prostitutes and teenage runaways, had been abducted, raped, tortured, and slain before having their bodies dumped. The articles didn't seem to have anything to do with Eddie. They were dated between May of 1995 and August of 1997. He couldn't have committed them. He would have only been 11. Next was a brief item from Entertainment Weekly magazine about the official cancellation of Till Death Do Us Part in the fall of 1997. Next was a brief item from Entertainment Weekly magazine about the official cancellation of Till Death Do Us Part in the fall of 1997. That was when the producers had announced that they would not be renewing our contracts for a fourth season. There were smudge marks on the ink. They looked like they were watermarks, or marks made by tears. This was followed by more news articles about the murders. The last was in July of 1998. I turned the page. I felt like I'd been punched between the eyes. It was a front-page headline from the Courier-Journal dated September 28, 1998. Killer apprehended, an end to a nightmare. I recognized the face in that mugshot. That dark hair, that hard face, and those intimidating dark eyes. It was an older version of that teenage boy, Eddie's brother, Ted. Below the headline was an article. I read it. Louisville. Police have finally arrested the man known as the Kentucky Ripper, who has terrorized the Jefferson County area for the past 3 years, leaving at least 20 victims in his wake. Earlier this morning at approximately 2:36 a.m., a man identified as Theodore William Voigt, 23, a Louisville native, was stopped by patrolman David Morris due to having a broken left taillight. Noting Mr. Voigt was acting suspicious, Officer Morris decided to search the vehicle. In the trunk, he made a grisly discovery, the partially dismembered body of an as-yet unidentified young woman. Officer Morris then placed Voigt under arrest. A young boy in the passenger seat of Voigt's car is believed to be his younger brother. Police have not yet said. I felt like I was going to vomit. Eddie's brother, Ted, was a serial killer. With trembling hands, I turned the page. Another article from the Courier-Journal, dated December 13th, 1999. Killer sentenced to death. Ted Voigt had been found guilty and sentenced to die for his crimes. He was sent to the death row at Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville to wait for his sentence to be carried out. A key witness at the trial had been his 13-year-old brother Francis, who he had been the legal guardian of, and who had been present at and witnessed firsthand several of his murders. Francis claimed he had been an unwilling participant in his brother's crime spree and had acted as his accomplice out of fear and intimidation. The article noted that as the boy was testifying, Ted Voigt had reacted with a violent outburst and had had to be forcibly removed from the courtroom by a bailiff. Oh my gosh. No wonder poor Eddie had gone insane. I felt something for him right then that until that moment had been a completely foreign emotion. Pity. I turned the page. Another news headline. Voigt dies by lethal injection. Justice is done. The date on it was July 30th, 2007. After 8 years on Kentucky's death row, notorious serial killer Theodore W. Voigt has met his end. His sentence was carried out by lethal injection at midnight on July 29th, Defiant to the end, the remorseless murderer's last words before death were, "Go to hell." And below that, Eddie had scrawled, "After you." That was the last thing in the scrapbook. The rest of the pages were blank. I closed it and placed it back at the bottom of the wardrobe and then shut the door. A wave of anxiety overwhelmed me. I suddenly felt very vulnerable. I had no idea what time it was or how long I had been looking through Eddie's scrapbook. He could be back any time. I had to get back to my room now. I started to leave and almost tripped over an extension cord running across the floor. I followed it with my eyes from an outlet in the wall to where it disappeared. Behind the bookcase. Some inner voice was telling me to let it go, just get out of there and get back to my room before something horrible happened. But I ignored it. My curiosity got the best of me. I went to the bookcase and very carefully pushed it out of the way, revealing a hidden door. It must be his closet. I turned the knob and opened it. The closet was dark, but there was a hanging light cord. I pulled it. The light came on. I had to put a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. Eddie's closet had been transformed into a shrine. A shrine dedicated to me. The upper wall was plastered with pictures, all shapes and sizes, some overlapping. Publicity shots of me in promos for the show, screenshots from the episodes he must have printed off the internet. There were even pictures of me from the handful of low-budget movies and TV shows I had appeared in after Till Death Do Us Part went off the air. Hundreds of them. At the bottom of the closet was an old analog TV and an ancient-looking VCR, both plugged into a power strip hooked up to the extension cord I had seen. On the VCR was a stack of old VHS tapes. Printed on the label in black marker was, "Easier bread than done." March 22nd, 95. Of Mice and Glen, March 29th, 95. The Sound and the Blurry, April 6, 95. A Man's Home is His Prison, April 13th, 95. I recognized them as titles of episodes of the show. Eddie must have taped them off TV when they first aired. There were about a dozen other tapes. I sifted through them all until I found a tape that only had a single episode listed on it. Fast Times at Fugate High. May 23rd, 97. I realized that this was the last episode of the show. I dimly remembered filming it back in early 97. None of us had known at the time it was going to be the last show, but we had heard rumors that the studio brass was talking about pulling the plug after we finished filming that season. But they had said the same thing about the first 2 seasons, and none of us had taken them seriously. I don't know what compelled me to do what I did next, but I sat down in front of the TV, turned it on, and inserted the tape into the VCR. I pressed play and watched as the show opened with the familiar credit sequence and theme music. The quality of the tape was badly degraded and marred with tracking errors, as if it had been watched 100 times and was almost worn out. All the commercial breaks had been edited out. I sat there and watched the entire episode from beginning to end, remembering the story as it played out. Emily is heartbroken after discovering her boyfriend, school football star Chad Richardson, cheated on her with another girl. She breaks up with him, then, out of revenge, agrees to attend the upcoming senior prom with Eddie Caldwell, a lonely, skinny reject who had been pining after her for years. Initially, her sole motive is to make Chad jealous. But during their dance, she realizes that Eddie genuinely loves her and she develops feelings for him. They share a romantic kiss. Chad eventually comes back, pleading for Emily's forgiveness, begging her to take him back. Both boys learn about each other and begin vying for her affection. Emily is torn between the arrogant, shallow jock and the gentle, sensitive nerd. She finally makes up her mind and in the last minutes of the last episode, picks up her phone to call whichever one she's chosen. It ends right there on a cliffhanger. No one ever found out if she chose Chad or Eddie. And given our poor ratings, I I hadn't thought there had been anyone who cared either way. I was wrong. A lonely, abused, psychologically damaged boy, subjected to God knew what horrors by his sadistic older sibling who lived in Louisville, Kentucky, had cared. An 11-year-old boy who had what had perhaps begun as an innocent crush on the beautiful Emily Glover, and by extension, the actress who had portrayed her, which had gradually become an obsession, who had maybe identified with the fictional Eddie Caldwell, and eventually he had identified with him so much he couldn't distinguish reality from make-believe. He began to believe he was Eddie Caldwell. I understood then what this was all about, what it had always been about. It hadn't been Eddie just wanting to go out with me on Valentine's Day. It wasn't even him wanting me to attend the prom with him. Those were just things leading up to the main event. Eddie had never gotten the closure he'd been seeking. Had never found out if Emily chose him or Chad. He had been waiting all these years to find out which one she loved. I rewound the tape and then ejected it, placing it back with the others in their original order. I turned off the TV, closed the closet, scooted the bookcase back in place. Took a final look around to make sure I hadn't overlooked anything, left any evidence from my visit behind. And then I left his bedroom, closing the door and snapping the padlock in place. I went back to my bedroom, removed the tape from the lock, and shut the door, hearing the lock engage as it closed. And then I waited for Eddie to come home. I didn't know what was going to happen after the prom. Maybe he'd snap out of it, return to his senses, and let me go. Or maybe he'd kill me. There was nothing I could do but go along with it and hope for the best.